Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. We're starting to see some water temperatures creeping out of the 40s and getting into the 50-degree range, depending on where you're at in the country. When that happens, we start seeing a transition of fish that are going from their wintering phase into their pre-spawn phase. It's a very early pre-spawn phase, but when that happens, one of the best techniques that you can pick up is a wake bait, guys. I can tell you from experience that when you hit that window where a wake bait is really good, it's tough to beat. It can be an absolute fish catching machine. So that's what we're going to talk about today, our wake baits. Even though we're still completely froze over here in Wisconsin, there are a lot of you across the country that will be thinking about throwing a wake bait sometime here soon. So I just want to give an overview about it, talk a little bit about the process, what to look for, some areas to look for, and to make sure you're not missing out on this bite, because a wake bait is a super fun way to fish and it can generate some really big bites for you. Before I do get into that, I do want to remind you guys about the lake breakdowns that I've been working on with fishthemoment.com. If you go into the description, you can see the link. It'll take you right to the lake breakdowns. If the lakes that you want me to cover are not there, then feel free to fill out a form for a personalized lake breakdown, and we can take that approach as well. But it's a really good way to get you guys headed in the right direction on the lakes that you like to fish. You get 40 different waypoints that cover different parts of the lake, and it's all done based on season. So if you're thinking about needing some help for the spring months, check out the lake breakdowns. I also want to remind you guys that if you want to support the channel, I've got a store with a bunch of different merchandise in it, so you can go rep the merchandise and therefore promote the channel that way. It's a good way to support the channel. Okay, guys, so let's talk about some wake baits. Wake baits, for the most part, wake bait is kind of a general term. Most people, when they think about a wake bait, think about like the old school bomber long A. This is an old version of it that kind of started the whole craze of wake baits. You know, this is more of just a minnow style bait, but because of the plastic that this was made out of, it was kind of a high floating bait. So if you retrieved it at a slow pace, it stayed on the surface. And the idea behind a wake bait is to have your bait stay on the surface. So when you retrieve it, what it does is it creates a V pattern behind the bait. It's a wake bait because it's creating a wake on the surface. One of the most difficult things to find a good wake bait is to find a bait that does stay on the surface at a slow to medium retrieve. Most baits will try to dive at certain times, and therefore there's a lot of tackle and certain equipment that you want to use to help your bait stay on the surface. But it's something that creates an issue. You can't necessarily grab any jerk bait and say, I'm going to turn it into a wake bait, or any crankbait. Obviously, if you have a floating bait and you retrieve it at a slow enough speed, that bait will stay on the surface. So most baits can be turned into a wake bait, but you want to have a bait that will allow you to cover some water without retrieving the bait at 1 inch per second. Like, you just need something that will stay on the surface at a little bit faster of a retrieve. But I mean, ideally, you could take a deep diving crankbait and keep it on the surface. You just have to retrieve it that slow. So to find a good wake bait that stays on the surface at a decent speed is the hard part. The bomber long A, this old bomber long A, was kind of the first bait that people really turned to. It's a very good bait for that. But since then, there are a bunch of good baits that are on the market that will stay up because they're designed to stay up. So a lot of custom makers make some good balsa baits that float higher, or some wood baits. And then there's just a bunch of other baits that are designed to have a diving lip that are more flush in the water to prevent the bait from diving, but still give it the wiggle. And we'll go over a couple of my favorite baits here in a little bit. But let's still just talk about the idea behind this and the equipment that you want to use to maximize the ability to get your bait to stay on the surface. So the first thing has to do with your tackle. Now, one of the issues here is it's hard to cast a lot of these baits because in order for them to stay on the surface, a lot of them weigh less and therefore they're hard to cast. So there's a couple things you can do about that. You can either use spinning gear, or you can use some of these new bait casters that are out that are meant to cast light objects. Those will increase your casting distance. You also want to choose a rod that's got some good length to it. I prefer to use this on a spinning gear tackle, so I'm usually throwing a medium light 7'3" spinning rod with a a normal retrieve spinning reel, because I can get more distance out of a longer rod, and I like the light action because the rod loads up better. Uh, the more you get a rod to load up, the better you get kind of that slingshot ability to launch your bait further. So my choice is spinning gear, but you can choose a good bait casting setup for this. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily consider it your finesse bait casters, but it's definitely more along that line where you want to choose a little bit lighter action rod and a bait casting reel that will definitely pair up well with a light bait. From a line perspective, and this may be the most key, there's two ways, in my opinion, to go about it. One, I will like to throw it on braid. I'll throw like a 10-pound braid main line, but then I'm tying it to a 10-pound monofilament leader. I do not want to use fluorocarbon in this instance because the fluorocarbon will tend to want to sink and pull the nose of the bait down. So you can throw direct braid, and you can also throw braid to a monofilament leader. The reason I choose to go with the monofilament leader is the fact that I like to have a little bit more stretch in my line, and it's generally a pretty long leader. So I'm throwing like a 10 to 15 foot leader, and that's so that when the fish bites it, the bait is going to give, there's a little bit more stretch, because these aren't normally like normal topwater bites where the fish come up and explode on a bait. A lot of times they'll come up and just slurp it, and they'll just suck it down, so your bait just kind of pulls under the water. So they're not super aggressive bites a lot of times, because remember, the key range for this is when you hit into that 50-degree range. In my opinion, it's that 50 to 60-degree range, even up into the low 60s if the fish aren't quite up on bed yet. But the idea here is they're not super aggressive. So you're not going to get those super aggressive strikes where they're truly trying to suck that bait in. A lot of times you'll get the fish where they're hooked just on the back hook because they're coming up and just swirling on it. So because of that, I like to throw monofilament leader, like a 10-pound monofilament leader, even an 8-pound sometimes I'll go with. Just depends on the scenario that I'm fishing. And if I'm in super gin clear water, I will go down to an 8-pound test leader. The key here, though, is I do not think you want to use it on straight fluorocarbon. I think you're better off going with straight mono, straight braid, or a mono leader on braid. Because the reason I like to go with the braid is also because I can throw a lot further with braided line than I can if I'm using straight monofilament. So I like the distance I can get from the braid. I like the little bit of a stretch from monofilament, and that's the right setup in my opinion. So you want a soft rod, you want a long rod, and you got to do everything you can to make the longest cast possible. So from a retrieve standpoint, pretty simple. You want your bait to be on the surface. In order to do that, most people will actually keep their rod tip higher up in the air, a nice steady slow retrieve, and you want to keep your bait to the point where it's moving as fast as it can without diving, and you want to be able to keep it moving fast enough to create a nice wake and get wiggle out of your bait. That's the hard part. So every bait that you choose will have a different correct running speed. Some baits will run better at a faster retrieve. Other baits will run better at a slower retrieve. But the key here is you generally need to keep your rod tip up, and you'll retrieve it. And as you're bringing it back, you're going to have to drop your rod tip towards the bait. Because if you keep your rod tip up, the bait's going to want to pull up. It's not going to run right. And if you drop your rod tip too far down, the bait's going to want to dive, and you're not going to get the V. So there's a little bit of an art in terms of learning the correct rod position with your bait, but that's something you can experiment with, and it changes based on the baits that you choose. But the key is to keep it moving where you have a nice wake on the surface, you get good wiggle out of your bait, but the bait is not diving into the water. So here are some different baits that I like to use. Obviously, the old Bomber Long A is a good one. If you can still find it or you're lucky enough to have some, it works great. Some newer ones that are still on the market that are also excellent baits. The Berkley Surge Shad is a great one. This is a big profile bait, so it floats higher, stays on the surface. It is an extremely easy bait to use. I also like they've got their reflector in the bottom so that as it's wobbling back and forth, it creates a little bit of reflection. I really like, depending where you're at in the country, I wanted to show this one to you. If you're fishing around smallmouth, I like black baits. I like black baits, topwater baits anywhere I go because it provides a good silhouette on the surface, but it's really good color if you're fishing around smallmouth, and smallmouth love a wake bait. If I'm fishing more spotted bass, then generally I'm going to go with more of my pearls or minnow colored baits. Same thing. Largemouth I actually like a little bit more color, natural color. But this is a custom made, that's PH Custom, a Wake Up. This is an excellent one. This is a wood bait that's got, it floats real high, runs very true again. These, being that it's a custom bait, I want to say are like 17 or 18 bucks, but they are very true running, very good baits. When I was talking about largemouth colors, I tend to do better on largemouth if I'm throwing more of a natural color. This is a Jackal Mickey, or a Mikey Jr., and this is a jointed one. Again, very good running. It doesn't have quite the same V just because it's a double jointed bait, so it's a tighter wiggle. Very good bait, and this is one of the colors I like for largemouth. I don't know the name of it, but it's got like a purple pearlescent on the back. And then another really good old standby, and this is just the jointed floating Rapala. This is one that's been around forever, and it runs really good on the surface as well. Again, it's a little tighter just because you get the jointed action in it. But this is, again, another very time-tested, proven bait that works great no matter where you're at in the country. So those 5 baits are ones that I'll use. But keep in mind, there are tons of wake baits, and there are tons of baits out there that you can turn into a wake bait just by retrieving them at a much slower speed than they were meant to be. Now, I don't recommend going and getting a big deep diving crankbait and saying I'm going to use it that way, but most, not most, but a lot of the shallow running square bills can be efficiently used as a wake bait. There's a bunch of other like prop style baits out there, kind of like your Bagley Bangalores that have props built on the back that can be used as wake baits as well. Generally though, I want a bait that's just a straight retrieve. I'm not really stopping, not starting, just simple straight retrieve. In terms of where I'm looking to fish with this, it kind of depends again on species, but the rule of thumb in my opinion is if you've got fish feeding on shad, so if you've got a cove that's got a lot of shad in it, and you'll see, once the water starts getting into the 50s in the morning, you'll see a lot of fish coming up and slurping shad off the surface. That's a really ideal place to throw a wake bait. Just super, super ideal, kind of classic thing. The next would be any sort of rock transition or just 45-degree bank. If you've got clear water anywhere, you're fishing, you'll have fish come up from 15 or 20 feet to hit these baits because they're just a slow, tempting bait that the fish can't necessarily turn down. But I love to use them down like 45-degree banks or a little less than that where fish are thinking about spawning. A lot of those banks, that spotted bass and smallmouth spawn on, even largemouth to an extent, maybe a little bit steeper, not bluffy, but steeper or a little bit stair-stepped. And those are really good places to throw a wake bait, more like a parallel down the bank or a 45 to the bank. You'll get a lot of those fish that are staging to move up to start creating a bed to spawn. And even when the fish start getting on a bed, they're a really good bait, not necessarily to get the fish to commit all the time to it, but a lot of times those fish that are on beds will come up and swirl underneath the bait to kind of act like they're chasing it away. And at that point, they're giving up their location. So it's a really good search bait to identify where fish are holding. But for me, it's usually one of those two things, especially if I'm down south or more on like the Ozark Lakes or more highland impoundment lakes. It's going to be usually centered around fishing shad, around shad, or it's going to be more of a parallel down the bank. The one thing I'll add, around here in the North Country, if you've got a smallmouth spawning flat, so a lot of the flats we'll have smallmouth that are spawning, say, anywhere from 4 to 15 feet of water, depending on how clear the water is. But you'll have these shallow sand, rock transition, gravelly, maybe some scattered pieces of grass that those smallmouth will get up on, and they'll stage pre-spawn wise, and then they'll spawn, and then they'll be in their post-spawn phase. A wake bait over the top of them can be absolutely killer. That's where like this Berkeley surge shad in a black color is just hard for them to resist. And again, a lot of times if they're on the bed, they'll come up and show themselves. But at that point, you know where they're at, and you can slow down with your, 4-inch Berkeley General or a flatworm, something like that. And you can almost always catch those fish, but it's a really good locating bait. But guys, this is the time of year. I mean, when you get water temps that creep up into the 50s, all the way up until when they really get on the bed, it can be an absolutely killer bait. Like there's times this bait is what generates the bites. You could see fish busting shad and you can't get them to really commit to anything else, but you slow roll a wake bait through there and they just cannot resist it. It's pretty crazy, and it's excellent on all of the bass species. They all will eat this bait really well. So guys, I hope this was helpful. I'm looking forward to getting out and throwing some wake baits. I cannot wait for it. It's one of my favorite ways to fish in the early spring periods because it catches big fish and it catches numbers. And it's just something that gives the fish a little different look because not everybody's doing it, because it is a very slow way to fish. And a lot of people don't have the patience to slow down and do it. But if you do, you can be really rewarded well. So I hope it was helpful. If it was, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, another video coming out tomorrow.